The one thing I do want to say is that we have learned different perspectives from minority groups, cultural identities, from books, as well as documentaries. But for us, the best way to learn about these groups is to get it from the people themselves. So today, class, me and Professor Drummond are going to move aside, and today our professors and our teachers class are going to be the Garifuna people themselves, and they're going to tell you their own story.
One of our core tenets in Ethnic Studies department is to let people and empower people to tell their own stories from their cultural heritage. So this is what we're going to be doing today.
So everybody, please, let's give a big Moore College a round of applause to our special guest today, the Garifuna community. Everybody.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Cheryl Morales, and I am the founder and president of Garifuna American Heritage Foundation, United here in California. And one of our missions is, this is what we do. We come into the communities and we try to teach students and people who've never heard about the Garifuna people. How many people have ever heard of the Garifuna people? Raise your hand. So this is what we do. We've been doing this since 2005. We go to university schools, elementaries, and everything so we can teach you about our culture. So I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate you taking the time to understand and get to know my perspective as a Garifuna person. So Garifuna journey from Yurumein through Roatan. Next slide, please. Yurumein, St. Vincent, is the name of the Garinagu Garifuna people homeland in our native language. I'm going to interchange and say Garinagu and Garifuna. Kalina is our indigenous name to ourselves. And Garifuna is the name that we call ourselves now. But throughout history, when you read the history book, we're referred to as Caribs in some history books, and then later on as Black Caribs. And we're going to get into the history of how those names evolved over time. St. Vincent has been inhabited for some 7,000 years by the Sudanese, Lokono, who are also the Arawaks, Kalina, and Carib. When Columbus stumbled upon St. Vincent in January 1498, the island had been inhabited for nearly 200 years by the Garinagu people. Although there is no apparent evidence that Columbus actually made it to St. Vincent, the documents say that he was basically in a nearby island, but he never went to St. Vincent. But in some of the books that you'll read, you'll say that he actually stepped foot on St. Vincent, but he did not. Yurumein is in the Lesser Antilles. The Lesser Antilles are a group of about 24 small island states within the Caribbean and Atlantic Ocean. The Garinagu territories stretch over 500 miles from Grenada, Tobago, St. Vincent, Lucia, and so far. Dominica and Martinique were considered the territory of the Lokono Arawaks. Next slide. This picture here is the picture of the current Garifuna chief in St. Vincent, the Yurumein. The Kalina would often form unions with the Lokono tribe, who later inhabited neighboring Dominica. According to Taino historian Huacao Vidal, to conquer and divide the tribes, the Europeans fabricated the story that the Kalina men would slaughter the Lokono men and kidnap the women and make them their wives. That wasn't true. Unfortunately, this is one of the many disparaging stories that continue, and you'll continue to read it in history books. And we're trying to correct that. Again, so in the Mali history, the oral history, it tells of Abubakari. Abubakari is a prince from Mali who abdicated his throne. He didn't want the throne anymore. And one of his many speeches, which is documented in the University of Timbuktu, he said, "I will leave you the land and I'm going to conquer the sea." So he set out, he had 2 voyages. The first voyages, he had 200 ships with men and with equipment. And when they landed, only 1 ship returned, because they were supposed to go there, explore, and then come back to Africa and then, give the accounts of what they found. And if you know the geography of Africa, the way that the current runs, it automatically lands towards here at the United States. So when they initially went on the first voyage, again, 200 trips and only one came back and was able to tell them, this is what happened. So on the second journey, he went ahead and he had 2,000 ships. 1,000 ships with men. There's no evidence that women were brought with them. It was 1,000 ships of men and then another 1,000 ships of equipment. And they landed and made it to St. Vincent. And those are our ancestors. They intermarried with the Native Americans, and which consists of the Arawak, Carib, and the Mali Africans. That's what makes us Garifuna. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of demonstrate to you is to make us a little bit more aware of, to make sure that people knew the difference between Garifuna people, because of course, during that time, they were already incorporating slaves to the Caribbean. So in order for them to make a distinction between who the Garifuna people were, because of our various hues, one of the things that we did was we would get a little plywood and we would put it on the baby's forehead to flatten their forehead. So it would leave a distinction mark that we had a flatter head. So it was always known that if you had a flatter head, you were Garifuna. One of the other things that we did when kids were, if you were a girl child, they would massage your nose. So you would have the distinct feature of your Native American mother. For the boys, they didn't do that. The boys, they wanted them to have their African father's features. But for the girl children, they wanted them to have their Amerindian mother's nose. Another thing that they did for the girls was they bind their feet. So they would have small and narrow feet like their Amerindian mothers. Now, for the boys, they wanted them to have their African male feature of their feet, the wide feet, the big feet. So they didn't bind the boys' feet. Those are some of the things that we did to kind of distinguish ourselves. And also some of the things, we didn't have hospitals back then. So one of the many birth things that we did is that just by looking at the color of the poo, they were able to tell you if the kids were sick, if the mole was down. If the mole was down, the color of the poo looked like a certain way. And they knew how to flip up the mole. They would flip the baby over, knock it down, flip the baby back up. They would suck on top of the head. And then by the color of the poo, they would know that they had closed the mole. Those are the traditions that they did. Those are the traditions that they taught me when I had my own children. When I had my children, my mother taught me how to do this with my 2 kids. And also after a woman had a baby, they would bind their stomach. You know, so those are some of the things that we did. And one of the marriage rituals that we had, prior to Garifuna people getting married, we had to establish kinship. We needed to make sure that we were not closely related, because within the islands and everything, we intermarried with each other. So one of the things that they did was they would meet with the families to establish kinship, and if they had any kind of, let's say, beef issues with somebody with the family, they would work that out. So if the families agreed on the marriage, one of the things that they did was, of course, there was a dowry back then. And from the elders, they said they continued to practice the dowry even when we went to Central America for some time. So they would establish dowries, the family would pay it or whatnot. And on the wedding day, the mother of the groom would fix the honeymoon hut. So what they did with fixing the honeymoon hut, they would lay burlap. You know, because you slept on the floor, you slept in the hammock. So during the honeymoon night, whatever transpired, the next morning, the mother of the groom would come to verify that the wife was pure or unpure. If the wife was still a virgin or not a virgin, they could dissolve the marriage. You know, if the wife was proven to not be a virgin, the marriage was dissolved. But it was proven that she was still intact or whatnot, then the marriage would continue to go through. So that was some of the things that we did as part of our tradition. Again, in 1311, that's when the second voyage arrived with the Africans from Mali, and they intermarried with the Native Americans, and then that gave birth to us, the Garifuna people. Next slide. The Europeans began to arrive in Yurumein and other islands in 1498. The British, who were called planters, here they were called, I think, colonies, but over there they were called planters throughout the Caribbean. So the British came first, followed by the French later, and they established settlements throughout Yurumein. So we went from having this whole territory of land that was ours. And one thing about the Carib territory, if you think about the word the Caribbean Sea, Caribbean Ocean, they named that to mark off all that territory to let the Europeans know that all of this territory belonged to us. That was all Carib territories. But I'm sure you never heard that before, but that was the reason why they called it after us, to basically give their warning, like, don't go there. Those are hostile people. You don't want to mess with them. So, again, followed by the French, later established settlement in Yurumein, and they started to displace the Garinagu people. And one of the things that they wanted the land for was for sugar plantation. That was the #1 product in the Caribbean, was sugar plantation for rum and everything like that. So they continued to come to St. Vincent. We signed several treaties with them, and every treaty that we signed with them were violated. We had a peace treaty. You know, it's called the Carib Peace Treaty, Treaty of Peace. That was violated, where we established that St. Vincent and Dominica was Garifuna territory. But after that treaty was violated, we had several wars. And we're gonna get into that a little bit. So again, the increased presence of the Europeans and their illegal land grabbing would lead to 150 years battles and 2 major wars between the Garinagu and the various European groups. In Christopher Taylor's book, The Black Carib War, unbeknownst to the Carib of St. Vincent, the island had been granted by King Charles II of England to an earl in 1627. And what he did was, he granted this individual the land with all of the Carib people included with the sale of this land. When he said all, it was meaning all of the Carib people that were along the Caribbean coast. And of course, we did not agree to that. So being the type of people that we were, we continued and we commenced the war to fight for our property. Because everything that happened with Garifuna people and with the British had nothing to do with slavery. It had everything to do with indigenous land rights. Everything to do with indigenous land rights. They came, they wanted our land, they occupied our land, and we fought for our land for 150 years. And people are like, how are you able to fight them for 150 years? Just like how I talked about all of the natural remedies that we did with childbearing. We knew our earth. We knew our land. We knew our plants. We knew our plants had certain, properties that if you use it, it'll sting you, it'll stun you. If you used it and it was more potent, it would kill you. So we knew the terrain, we knew what plants to use, and we weaponized like chemical weaponry. We knew that before it was even a thing. We knew how to use the plants to go ahead and have, different things to aid in our support of fighting for over 150 years. They had muskets, we had machetes, we had all these other things, but we were able to keep one of the strongest military at the time at bay for 150 years. That speaks volumes. And throughout some of your readings, you'll probably hear Garifuna people are escaped shipwreck. That was propaganda. Those are one of the things, if you label an indigenous group not indigenous to that land, then they had no right to that land. So that was the thing that started happening, that if you read history books, certain history books, they'll say, well, Garifuna, it was just Caribs. It was just Caribs, they were Garinagu, they were Caribs. Then later on, like around the late turn of the century, they started calling us black Caribs. Then they started labeling yellow Caribs, red Caribs, when we were just one people with different hues. Kind of like all of the beautiful hues that I see in this room today. According to the archives, the British intentionally went from calling the Caribs of St. Vincent to refer to them as black Caribs around the 1760s. At a council meeting dated May 10, 1767, the attendees discussed drafting a militia bill against the black Caribs. In Julie Jen's writing, The Caribs of St. Vincent and the Indigenous Resistance During the Age of Revolution. In particular, the British turned in the late 18th century to a strategy of renaming the Caribs of St. Vincent the black Caribs, attributing to their primarily being from Africa, meaning that we didn't have indigenous right land here on the American continent, that we were indigenous to the African continent, but we know that's not true. The first Carib War began from 1772 through 1773. The second Carib War was from 1795 until 1797. Next slide. Between October 1796 and March 1797, an estimated 4,338 to 5,200 black Caribs were captured and imprisoned on a barren island known as Belize. The exact number captured, tortured, and imprisoned, Garinagu varies from the different resources. So, in this picture of the cannon, over here, the cannon is actually pointed towards the Garifuna villages. So if you're looking, when you're looking at forts and you're surrounded by the ocean, you're usually protecting your property and you're facing your cannons to the ocean. But with them, they were facing the cannons towards us, towards our village, while we were fighting for our land. So when you look down there, we went here in 2019, and it was eerie to see that. They had 11 cannons all along, pointing towards the Garifuna villages. And the next picture is Belize, a barren island, where we were imprisoned there for over 18 months, where half of our population died. 5,000 went in, and less than 2,000, around 2,000, were left alive. Many of my ancestors died of starvation, of diseases, and so many other things. Those who survived after the 18 months were rounded up together, and they were exiled. These are the names of the ships, the convoys, the 11 vessels that exiled the Garifuna people. We left Begwa Saturday, 11 March, 1797. And out of the 11 vessels that left, only 10 ships made it. One ship sank with everybody on board. We don't know how many people were on that ship, but one ship did sink with all of the people dying on that ship. Another ship made a supply stop in Jamaica. Now, being that Jamaica is also, Carib territory, we were familiar with the area. So when they went there and they did their stuff getting their supply, the Garifuna people on that ship took the opportunity to run to the hills to meet with the other Carib people that were there, and also the Maroons that were there. And they still reside there to this day. Next slide. I'm gonna go back a little bit. When we went to St. Vincent, we did go to Belize, and there's still nothing there. is uninhabited. There's no food there. It's literally, it's a difficult journey to get there. The waters are rough. And this is an area that even the locals today try to avoid because it's a difficult place to be. Really difficult to be. And they left us there for over 18 months. So this you will find at the National Army Museum in the United Kingdom. This was the medal that was given to the soldiers when they captured or killed a Garifuna person, a Kara person. You know, and they would, of course, they would enlist the help of the captured Africans to help to kill us. Although the Garifuna people were known throughout history to help and support escaped slaves. We would take them into our midst. We would do what we can to protect them because we knew slavery was wrong. But when their masters told them, to kill us, they had no problem killing us. So that's the history that we've had to deal with. It's part of our history. We've had to overcome, you know, like so many other things, but that is part of our history. Next slide. So after we were loaded up on the boat in Becca, we arrived in Honduras, you know, off Port Royal. At that time, you had British Honduras, which was owned by the British, and you had Spanish Honduras, which was owned by the Spanish territory. But in the area where the British exiled to us off of the port, it was British territory. And for some reason, they must have known, like, they must have known something that we were unaware of, because we didn't know where we were going. But I've been to Roatan, and I've been to St. Vincent, and they look like the same exact place. When you look down into the ocean, it's like, wow. It's like they literally just transplanted us from Yurumein to another Yurumein in Central America, but it looks exactly alike. The terrain and everything, the hilliness, the greenery, is so similar. And I guess they figure, well, if we have them to an island that looks similar to theirs, we'll probably not want to come back, but you know, you miss home. Home is the most important thing. That's our lineage. The Garifuna people arrived on April 12, 1797, to Port Royal in Roatan, then an English colony. However, the Garifuna people were granted entry by the Spaniards into the mainland Trujillo, Spanish Honduras, on May 17, 1797. So, one of the things that were recorded was an unknown Carib chief, who upon arrival to Roatan is reported to have proclaimed, "I do not command in the name of anyone. I am not English, I am not French, nor am I Spanish, nor do I care to be any of those things. I am a Carib subordinate to no one. I do not care to be more or to have more than what I have and who I am." That's a powerful statement, because we talk about identity and the importance of knowing who you are. It was important for this Garifuna man, even though they took away his land, they exiled him, killed his family, but the most important thing was for him to know who he was and to maintain his identity as a Garifuna person. And I do that here. When I proclaim myself in the month of Black History Month as a Garifuna, it doesn't take away from my Blackness. It doesn't take away from my heritage of being, you know, of course, my African fathers. It doesn't take away from me and my ancestors residing in Central America, a predominantly Spanish country, besides Belize, which is an English country. It doesn't take away from my identity and the culture that we've inherited, that we've embraced throughout the Spanish territory. But I do not refer to myself as an Afro-Latina. I don't refer to myself as an African American. I refer to myself as a Garifuna. because my ancestors fought too hard for that. And again, it doesn't take away, it doesn't dismiss or diminish anything other than me holding on tight to what I believe in and what my ancestors gave me, which is part of my heritage to be Garifuna. And I hope all of you who have your various ethnic groups, whether you're Irish, Polish, Asian, whatever, that you embrace your heritage. That's part of your identity. We're all here in America, we're America hyphenated something, but we also inherit each of those cultures that are unique to each and every one of us, and we should embrace that and be proud of it all the time. According to research, the first Garifuna community in San Juan arrived around 1889. The evidence of the presence of Garinagu in San Juan Tela is found in official records on April 20th, 1891. What happened in San Juan was another massacre. During that time, all of those Spanish territories were not even countries yet. So everybody was vying for power. So the Garifuna people were accused of going against one of the popular parties that eventually won the presidency in that area. So they put out a bounty on Garifuna people. And they massacred, one of the famous massacres, what happened in Tela, is they gathered Garifuna men, women, and children in front of a Catholic church, made them dig a hole, and they shot them, killed them. And again, they put a bounty on Garifuna people's head. By that time, Garifuna people were residing in Guatemala, fearing for their lives. They fled Guatemala. Many of them fled Honduras. Some of them fled and they went to Nicaragua. Others of them fled, went to British Honduras at the time because it wasn't Belize yet, because they felt that they were going to be safe under British rule. That's a part of our history it's very deep. Because we were in a sanctuary thinking that we would be protected, but we were not protected. You know, and one of the things, when we landed in Roatan, we didn't have much. Again, Roatan was barren at the time. In order for us to get permission to go to the mainland to get supplies, it was the same Catholic Church that wouldn't allow us permission to go to the mainland until we were baptized, until they exorcised the demons from us, because that's what the Europeans say we were. We were demons, we were heathens, we were this. So in order for us to get permission to go to the mainland, we were baptized and given Spanish last name, because we didn't have surnames. That wasn't something that we had. But during that time, we were baptized and forced to take on Spanish last name. Hence, my name is Morales. You know, most people will say that it's Morales, but according to my father, my great-great-grandfather, being as stubborn as he was like, I refused to be Morales, M-O-R-A-L-E-S. So my grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, intentionally spelled the name N-O-R-A-L-E-Z. And every time it's like, I'm Cheryl Morales. Miss Morales, Miss Morales. No, no, I've never heard this name before. I told Mr. Garifuna name. Gary who? But you know, and you'll see a lot of names like that. You'll see Sambula. You'll see, they'll change it to Sam. You'll see Swatsto. You'll see Gil. They'll change it to Hill. So there's a whole lot of examples of how Garifuna people, even though they were forced to take on somebody else's surname, they made it their own. They made it their own Garifuna last name. So during that massacre, some Garifuna people fled to Belize from Honduras, and we're going to get into the history next. The next slide, please. The history of Garifuna people in Belize. The first sign of the Garifuna presence in Belize dates back to 1799, when Garinagu used to travel to Wallace Peter's place. Basically, they would just do different work. Garifuna people were able to earn an income. Again, they were not slaves, they were not indentured servants, so they were one of the few people that were able to earn an income, buy their lands. And what they did with that was they would pit the enslaved Africans against the free Garifuna people. They would tell them, you don't want to be around them. And they didn't want us to be around them. They didn't want us to influence them, especially in Belize. In Belize is the only place where they had a curfew for Garifuna people. We could only go out during certain times to work because they didn't want us to influence the Creole people, the enslaved Africans. They were a bad influence, and they didn't want us to put that free thought into their head. So we had a curfew there in Belize. Talking about the genocide earlier, at the beginning of 1832, there was a series of incidents that occurred with different missions. 3 different Allied armies attacked simultaneously the government forces of Moraza. He was still the president of Central America Federation. Remember, I said earlier that none of those places, Guatemala, Honduras, any of those Central American countries, they were not countries yet. So, during that same time when they had the massacre, that's when a group of Garifuna people led by Alejo Benny fled Honduras. And one of the people that was on the ship was the last chief's daughter, Joseph Chatier, who was killed during the war. And she had 13 kids, but 2 of the kids drowned en route to Belize. And she tried her best to save her children, but couldn't save them. But she did, it's documented that she was able to make her way to Belize. And there's also other evidence that other siblings were able to make it. The Chatier lineage was able to make it to Guatemala. But when you're an enemy of a country, of a British crown, because Garifuna people were charged with treason against the British crown. And the sentence to treason was death. So even upon putting us on these 11 ships, they weren't expecting us to survive. According to oral history from our ancestors, is they noticed that the food that they gave us, because we're vigilant, they saw that the rodents would go in and they would drop dead. So they wouldn't touch the food. It was a 30-day journey from Bequa, from St. Vincent to Central America. But they knew that they were getting poisoned. They saw the rodents getting killed. To this day, when you see Garifuna people, they're suspicious. They smell food, they smell the water, they'll look, they'll inspect it, they won't just eat from anybody because it's something that's embedded in them. Something that's embedded in them. And the ancestors always told us, you don't take anything from anyone because of that risk of poisoning. We knew it, we saw it, that they wanted to annihilate us. And a lot of people ended up sick, and a lot of people died on that voyage, going to Central America, that exile. So in Belize, the settlement day for Garifuna people is celebrated on November 19th. That's the day that they marked that was when that large contingent of Garifuna people landed in 1832 to what is now Danbriga. So that's a big thing in Belize, celebrated every year. Next slide. The Garifuna history is unknown. Now this is oral history account. So a lot of our traditional stories are through oral history and also in our temple, which we call it the Buyaba. So we go to our temple and in our spiritual belief, the ancestors come to certain people and they'll reveal things to them. So one of the oral history that we got from the temple is the history of how Labuga in Livingston, which is, in English it's called Livingston, was discovered and led there by Marcos Sanchez Diaz in about 1802. But again, due to all of the turmoil that was happening, I mentioned this, I kind of touched on it a little bit, because of the rampant murders of Garifuna people that was taking place throughout Honduras and everything, those families that migrated to Guatemala, a lot of them fled. At one time, there was over 1,000 families in Guatemala in that particular area. But during 1834, only 2 to 3 Garifuna families were reported at that time still living in Livingston, because they were afraid. They had went to Belize for safety to seek refuge. Due to their devotion and commitment to the development of the young Republican, Garinagu from Guatemala were granted citizenship during the well-known Central American Proclamation of Independence of 1821. What does that mean? Throughout all of the Central American countries where Garifuna people reside, Belize, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala is the only place during the time when they were writing their country's declaration, recognized the Garifuna people as indigenous to Guatemala in their constitution. Garifuna people are not recognized as indigenous people in Belize. They have a day, like I said, November 19th. In Honduras, we have a settlement day, an arrival day in Honduras, April 12th. In Nicaragua, they also celebrate November 19th as their arrival or settlement day. In Guatemala, we celebrate it on November 26th. But again, Garifuna people are embedded in the Guatemalan Constitution. Again, the Central American Proclamation of Independence of 1821. However, during the unsafe, tumultuous political climate between the years of 1831 through 1832, many Garinagu fled Labuga to Belize, often Stone Creek and Punta Gorda. During 1834, only 2 or 3 reported Garifuna families were living in Labuga. Marcos Montero, political chief of arms, commander of Port of Livingston, was sent to Belize to try to persuade Garinagu to take ownership of their land. As the authorities were desperate to inhabit the coast, many Garinagu decided to go back, arriving to Labuga on September 13, 1836, under the leadership of, again, Marcos Sanchez Diaz. In 1996, the government of Guatemala enacted National Garifuna Day on November 26th. Next slide. Our presence in Nicaragua. When you hear about Garifuna people history in Central America, they often neglect Nicaragua. But Nicaragua has several Garifuna communities. But again, when you read about it, it's usually, number 1, Belize, Honduras, and sometimes Guatemala, because there's still people who don't even realize that there's Garifuna people in Guatemala. I get it a lot of time. I have family in Guatemala. My great-grand aunt is from Guatemala, and my other family, my grandmother is from Guatemala, from Labuga, Livingston. So when I tell people I have family in Guatemala, it's amazing. In 2024, there's Black people in Guatemala? I'm like, yeah! But we still get it, They think Belize and they stay Belize, or they'll think, well, you must be from Brazil. I'm like, no, my family is from Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras, because I claim all of them. And so, the earliest report of Garifuna presence in Nicaragua is from 1865 to 1870. Of course, with everything that was going on, a lot of them fled over there, and they remain over there. And in the areas where the Garifuna people in Nicaragua, they lost their language. So a lot of them don't speak Garifuna, but they do have the culture, and there was a major push to try to reacculturate them. It's been maybe 20 to 40 years that they've been trying to reacculturate them, teaching them the language, teaching them the culture and everything like that in order for them to preserve their heritage and identity in Nicaragua. Next slide. The Garifuna migration to the United States. During the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, which is now known as Chiquita Banana, a lot of Garifuna people, a lot of Caribbean people from Jamaica and all those areas work for the United Fruit Companies. But especially Garifuna people, because like I said, Garifuna people were one of the few people that were allowed to work and earn their keep. While the other people, they had to get permission, and even if they did work, they weren't allowed to keep their money. But Garifuna people were allowed to keep their money, to work and everything like that. And the first wave of Garinagu migration to the United States from various Central American countries, including Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, Garifuna being natural seafarers were often hired as merchant marines. My grandfather was a merchant marine. He went all over the place. And told us many stories about his adventures. Again, Garifuna being natural seafarers were often hired as merchant marines or various other jobs for the United Fruit Company. During the 1954 Guatemalan coup, many Central Americans, including Garifuna, fled to the United States. And because the port where the United Fruit Company landed was in New Orleans, a lot of Garifuna people, a lot of Garifuna people landed. Their first port of call was there in New Orleans, in the lower wards. During Katrina, a lot of those people who were in the lower wards were Garifuna people, generations that lived there. Once upon a time, that was the mecca of Garifuna people, again, through the ports, through working for the United Fruit Company. They lived and they formed communities in New Orleans. And then that shifted after Katrina. A lot of those families that lived over there for centuries relocated to Houston. So now in Houston, there's a large Garifuna community of mainly Honduras and Guatemala over there in Houston. According to one of the elders, Mr. Clifford J. Palacio, the first Garifuna families arrived to Louisiana area around the mid-1940s, and later to Los Angeles area around 1950s. So we've been here a while. We've been here a while. In fact, one of the first African-American plays was about what happened in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But it never took place because the theater was burnt down. Because again, the propaganda. It was burnt down in 1832. And if you have to think about the things that were happening around there, you had the Nate Turner stuff happening. You had stuff in Haiti happening. And then now you had these Garifuna people causing mischief. And you wanted to write a play about it and spread it in America. That wasn't about to happen. So, they destroyed it. But you could Google it, look it up. The first African-American play by Henry Brown is about Joseph Chartier and the Garifuna people. Next slide. So our Garifuna native language. Garifuna is a verb, subject, object language. UNESCO status, critical endangered on May 18, 2001. The United Nations Culture Organization claimed Garifuna as an endangered language and culture. I always tell people, you have to be careful with me because I'm an endangered species. And we are, with a lot of native language, once we come here, we assimilate to America. When I first came to this country as a little kid, my first language was not English. But when I came here, it was like, you have to learn English. You can't speak that native language. It's not good. Back then, if you spoke two language, you were considered, it wasn't a good thing. And especially with myself. I was born hearing impaired, believe it or not. So going through speech therapy, one of the things that they told my parents was you can't speak two languages to her because of her hearing impairment. Either you have to speak English to her, or you have to speak her native language to her, but you can't do both. So what was happening is that when I went to school, of course I was speaking English, and then when I went home, it was Garifuna that was spoken in the household. But they encouraged my parents because I was learning how to speak, and learning how to enunciate my words, that it was important for them to focus on me learning English, but I retain a lot of my Garifuna words, a lot of my Garifuna ways. So, who want to learn a little bit of Garifuna alphabet? Let's go. We ready? Woohoo! Let's do this. Okay, Garifuna. I'll say it and you all repeat after me, okay? Okay. All righty. Garunati.
Garunati.
Ba.
Ba.
Sha.
Cha.
Da.
Da.
Gayumati.
Gayumati.
Ba.
Ba.
Ga.
Ga.
Ha.
Ha.
Garariti.
Gagiriti.
Ka.
Ka.
La.
La.
Ma.
Ma.
Na.
Na.
Nya.
Nya.
Gararati.
Kararati.
Pa.
Pa.
Ra.
Ra.
Sa.
Sa.
Ta.
Ta.
Maguti.
Maguti.
Gagati.
Gaguti.
Wa.
Wa.
Ya. Who want to spell their name in Garifuna? Did somebody say me? You want to try? No, there's no Z. If you notice, there's also no C.
Or X.
Yes, yes. So you can see the difference in our language. I'll leave a copy with your professor so you guys can have that. I wanted to bring the numbers, but that was going to be doing too much. So next slide. So if you notice throughout the whole presentation, I did not once mention shipwreck story. How many people have heard of Garifuna and the shipwreck story? Those who've done some research on Garifuna people, or those who've done research on their own. The first thing you'll hear is Garifuna, shipwreck slaves, whatever. But I don't mention that because growing up Garifuna, we knew our history. We always knew that we did not come from a shipwreck, so we never said that history. That was written about us. And again, it was written to justify to take our land. So that's a narrative that you will never ever hear me speak of or Gahfu speak of. And of course, over time, you have updated research to basically validate those points and prove everything wrong. The British and French archives do not show. Mind you, the British and the French, the Europeans were meticulous in documenting everything. Remember, human cargo were shipments. They were precious. They documented every shipwreck because that was a loss. And they were insured, and they got paid for that loss of property. So, if there was a shipwreck involving us, it would have been documented. But many researchers have looked for this documentation, because depending on what you read, you'll hear about shipwreck in 1635, shipwreck in 1661, shipwreck in 1675. It was the British, it was the Dutch, it was whatever, but it never happened. Again, the British and the French archives do not show any shipwreck reporting from 1659 through 1668. The only legit shipwreck during that time was documented, again, they wrote everything down, was in 1886. And all onboarded were reported dead. Furthermore, the documented shipwreck that reportedly happened in 1635 was heading towards West Indies, not the Antilles. So you will never, ever, ever hear me talk about a shipwreck because it doesn't exist. It never happened. So we're gonna transition in a little bit. I'm gonna give you time to ask a few questions, but I just want to kind of next slide. What you're gonna see in a little bit, in a traditional Garifuna music ensemble, which typically consists of a gayusa, a singer, a primera and segundo drummers, sometimes a sisera, which is a shaker, sometimes a turtle shell, and sometimes a wadapagate, which is a cone shell. Okay.